Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sydney University Law School. My name is Yana Svetiev, and I am a professor of market regulation and private law here at the law school. And I'm also the Associate Dean for Research Education, responsible for our higher degree by research programs. I would like to open with a sentence in the language of the Gadi people. Nini Nalwangan Maribujari Gadinurada. In the language of the Gadi people of the Eora Nation, it means we meet together on the very beautiful Gadi country. At this law school and at the University of Sydney, we use this greeting, which was crafted in consultation with the local community by the university's Director of Indigenous Knowledge and specialist in Indigenous languages, Professor Jacqueline Troy. We use it to acknowledge country, to recognize and pay respects to the elders and communities, past and present, of the lands on which the University of Sydney Law School stands. It is part of a broader commitment of the university and the law school to engage substantively with Indigenous communities, also by increasing the presence of First Nation students and staff and fostering understanding and dialogue with First Nations law in our new law curriculum that is being launched this year. In this semester, the first semester of the academic year, I teach contract law. And the first case that we ask students to read may be familiar to many in this audience. In Australian Securities and Investments Commission and COBELT, the High Court had to decide whether the provision of book-up credit to the Anangu people in remote South Australia amounted to unconscionable conduct. Credit was provided by Mr. COBELT on terms that were harsh, although without apparent complaint from the Anangu community. At all levels of the judicial hierarchy, COBELT was said to present a difficult case. On one reading, it involved conduct that exploited the lack of financial sophistication of the Anangu customers. On another, it disclosed the fundamental incommensurability between two cultures and institutions of exchange. On yet another reading, COBELT provided a source of credit to the Anangu customers who had no other options and for whom it served the purpose of maintaining their links of kin and community. In contract law, we studied to make students understand the different norms that support transactional and community trust. On a deeper reading, the case demonstrates the point that in the absence of other options against which we can benchmark our own conduct, even mutually beneficial long-term relationships can become exploitative. Competitive offerings provide us with a benchmark against which we can assess and reflect on our own conduct. And on this view, competition is not just a tool for enhancing efficiency. Even obligations of fairness and community may not be easy to define in the abstract. And this brings us precisely to the subject of today's event, building a competitive economy from the ground up. It is part of Let's Talk About Corporations, which is a joint initiative of the Sydney Law School and the University of Queensland Law School. I would like to especially acknowledge our University of Queensland Law School colleagues who are following us on a live feed, which is why the screens are on. This initiative was envisaged as a series of boardroom conversations about corporate governance and corporate regulation. It was launched at the beginning of 2023 by the previous chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, Rod Sims, who at the time called for a renewal of competition law tools and enforcement. And the ACCC and the government have both been busy over the last 2 years to heed that call. So it is very fitting to have among us today the Honorable Dr. Andrew Leigh, Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury, as well as the Assistant Minister for Employment. He has been responsible for steering some of these reforms, but beyond that, he's been a consistent advocate for competition. Readers of his monthly Leigh report will know that he also has a broader interest in evidence-based policy, including through experiments and randomized trials. He's a graduate of this university. He studied economics and then law, as did I. We have a few other biographical details in common, including that we both studied economics from Yanis Varoufakis, who came to fame as the Greek Minister for Finance during the Greek sovereign debt crisis. He went on to do a PhD in economics at Harvard's Kennedy School and eventually returned to Australia as Professor of Economics at the Australian National University. A path to parliament and political office through academia is fairly unusual, at least in this country. And throughout his ministerial tenure over the past 3 years, Andrew Leigh has been a regular guest at universities. On my count, this is the third time that he's back to his alma mater. I thought that it was the School of Economics that had put us to the post by inviting him to give the Warren Hogan lecture in 2022, but it turns out that he had already spoken at Sydney Ideas before that. In these times when the communication between the worlds of academia and politics is anything but smooth, and times of self-reflection and misunderstanding about the roles of university in society, it is good to have somebody like Andrew Leigh in our midst to facilitate awareness, communication, and understanding. I'm delighted to present him as today's guest keynote speaker for Let's Talk About Corporation, with the title From Monopoly to Lego, Building a Competitive Economy from the Ground Up.
Well, thank you, Janne, for a most delightful introduction. It's a real pleasure to be back at the University of Sydney Law School. Can I acknowledge, as you did, that we're meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to their elders and to all First Nations people present. It's also delightful to be in a room with these wonderful pictures of law lecturers, many of whom I remember from my Sydney Law School days. Alice Tay is up there on the wall. Alice was a formidable lecturer who did not take kindly to anybody who spoke out of turn. I remember her stopping the class and insisting on complete silence, as was perfectly reasonable at the time, shocking a group of undergraduate law students into submission. In Canberra, we have suburbs that are named after particular groups of people, and the suburb next to me is named after prominent lawyers and judges. And as we pass Alice Tay Street, I will sometimes tell that story to my 3 boys in the hope that they one day might behave a little better in their lectures than I did. And then fresh out of law school, I had the privilege of working for Justice Michael Kirby as one of his High Court associates. I answered the phone, put thousands of letters into envelopes, made hundreds of cups of Ceylon orange pekoe tea, and occasionally had the chance to do some legal research. And one of the things I learned is that lawyers would be lost without resources such as Corona's competition law. Pages dog-eared and tabbed to death. Corona's is a trusted source of how the courts have ruled and how arguments have been won or lost. Corona's texts also stand as a record of reform. Over many editions, it's captured everything from judgments on the original 1974 legislation to reforms allowing third parties to access infrastructure in the 1990s, to the introduction of criminal cartel sanctions in the 2000s. And today, a new round of competition reforms takes shape. That includes the new merger regime, the largest shake-up of Australian merger settings in half a century. And it includes a revitalised national competition policy agenda. And these are the 2 areas I want to cover today, with a focus on the microdata underpinning the reforms. Ultimately, competition reform is about improving the long-term prosperity of the Australian people. That means getting the policy settings right if we want to build a stronger, more resilient and more dynamic economy. Think of the end game as more like Lego than Monopoly. In Monopoly, one person gets everything while everyone else watches in frustration. In Lego, all the players get to build something, though in both cases, stepping on a piece can be painful. As US Congressman Jake Auchincloss puts it, everybody, when they think about playing with Legos, has this sense of creativity and empowerment. Competitive markets help ensure Australians pay fair prices for goods and services. Without competition, businesses can charge whatever they like. Kind of like airport food courts, where a ham and cheese sandwich requires a mortgage. Competition also promotes choice and freedom. The challenge is that Australia's competitiveness has been declining since the 2000s, while market concentration has nearly doubled since 2010. Our government's establishment of a competition task force within the Treasury in 2023 reflects the importance we place on competition reform and finding practical solutions. In that period, the Competition Task Force has made significant contributions. That includes using microdata to identify competition reform and develop tailored policy and regulatory responses. For example, the Competition Task Force has relied on data to develop a robust evidence base on the prevalence and use of non-compete clauses in Australian labour contracts, and thereby to inform policy. It's used microdata to provide new and powerful insights on how competition can reduce airfares. It's used microdata to explain patterns and trends in mergers and show how competition has declined in Australia. Unit-level records that track businesses and households over time allow a granular analysis of the way policies are influencing the economy. Using bigger data sets, more refined econometric techniques, and up-to-date theories, economists have provided new insights on trends in market concentration and on the relationship between competition and productivity. For example, researchers found that an increase in market power partly explained Australia's productivity growth slowdown. Industries with the greatest increase in concentration also had the greatest increase in markups. In this context, high-growth firms act like Lego builders in the economy, constantly assembling, adapting, and expanding their creation. Rather than dominating like a monopoly, these firms thrive by snapping together innovative ideas, new markets, and fresh talent, driving the majority of the economy's turnover and employment growth. Typically small and young, they grow by more than 20% over a 3-year period, often reshaping the landscape and challenging the older, more rigid structures of established incumbents. Think of them as startups disrupting the economy. Just as streaming services disrupted DVDs, Uber disrupts taxis, and toddlers disrupt your ability to get a full night's sleep. As vital builders of sales and employment, a decline in high-growth firms can lead to a less dynamic, less flexible economy. The Competition Task Force is working with the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission to develop a microdata screening tool to analyse concentration hotspots. This innovative tool leverages the increasingly detailed geospatial data that the Australian Bureau of Statistics has added to its microdata assets. The resulting tool will identify regions or segments of the economy that are already very concentrated, where further market consolidation through mergers and acquisition pose the greatest risk to competition. Concentration hotspots are like a heat map of where monopoly is being played a little too well, allowing policymakers to find solutions before someone puts a hotel on every property. The task force's use of administrative data to systematically understand economic activity at the local level will be a novel approach to competition policy, both in Australia and among peer nations. It'll complement the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission's thorough knowledge of markets developed through its many inquiries and day-to-day experience administering the competition laws. That hotspot tool should help the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission administer the new merger system and inform decisions about the sectors requiring mandatory notification. After all, if a monopoly player already owns Park Place or Park Lane, depending on which version you're playing, it's best for the other players if they don't own all the other dark blue properties as well. When monopolists dominate the board, it can be expensive for everyone else in the economy to move forward. These examples showcase how increased availability of microdata has transformed the way we use empirical evidence in the policy decision-making process to better identify issues, understand the problems, and develop effective, targeted solutions. Microdata gives us the tools and understanding to target policies. Building a more productive, dynamic, and resilient economy and giving Australian consumers access to a wide range of high-quality products and services at lower prices from across the country and overseas requires collaboration and trust. This is why Australian state and territory governments have been working with the Commonwealth to coordinate competition reform efforts under a revitalised national competition policy agenda. Almost 30 years ago, states, territories and the Commonwealth agreed to put competition front and centre by agreeing to the national competition policy following the Hilmer Report. This was the era of economic reform, alongside grunge music, dial-up internet, blockbuster video rentals, Tamagotchis, and arguing over whether Ross and Rachel were really on a break. Those original Hilmer reforms outlined a set of competition principles that transformed our economy in ways we largely take for granted today. These included structural reform of public monopolies, including competitive neutrality so that government businesses don't enjoy unfair advantages over their private peers, arrangements for third-party access to nationally significant infrastructure, and an obligation on all governments to review and reform laws that restrict competition. Those reforms, which focused on removing regulatory barriers in the non-traded sector, were credited with boosting Australia's GDP by 2.5%, equivalent to around $5,000 per household per year. That's the economic equivalent of finding an additional $50 in Eugene's pocket, twice a week, every week. Commonwealth, state and territory treasurers agreed last November to revitalise national competition policy to drive growth, improve choice and put downward pressure on prices. Renewing the government's commitment to put competition policy front and centre once again, but tailored for the new challenges and opportunities of the modern economy. We're now a digital economy. We're looking for ways to make the transition to net zero at least cost. And we have a growing care and support economy. We've updated the original national competition principles to derive better economic outcomes for the community, requiring governments to consider the competition impacts of government decisions and establish protections against poorly managed privatisations, empower consumers, and address remaining barriers to the movement of goods, services, and workers across the economy. Competition reform isn't straightforward. If it was easy, past governments would have done the task already. Competition reform can be like assembling flat pack furniture. You know it'll be worth it in the end, but along the way, there's a lot of frustration and some pieces don't always seem to fit where they should. Our competition policy reforms recommit governments to a new wave of pro-competitive reforms over the next decade. Work's already underway on a first tranche of 5 priority reforms to ease cost of living pressures and reduce regulatory complexity. Those 5 pillars are: first, streamlining commercial planning and zoning systems to improve competition by encouraging firm entry and expansion and reducing business and regulatory costs. Second, lowering barriers to the adoption of international and overseas standards in regulation. We're fast-tracking the recognition of equivalent or superior overseas product safety standards, rather than relying only on domestic standards, to deliver safer and cheaper products. Following this, we'll be working collaboratively to identify the priority sectors for the next phase of the reform. Third, supporting modern methods of construction, such as prefab and modular, by levelling the regulatory playing field with traditional methods of construction, unlocking time and cost savings, overcoming labour shortages, and boosting lagging construction productivity. Fourth, a nationally consistent worker screening check to boost labour mobility for care workers. And fifth, developing broader rights to repair, including for agricultural products, which could reduce repair costs and waste by providing consumers and businesses more choice for repair services. State and territory reforms are backed by the government's $900 million National Productivity Fund. This allows for the fiscal benefits of these reforms, which mostly flow to the Commonwealth, to be shared with the states and territories that choose to implement them. The idea is to encourage states and territories to undertake meaningful reforms for the benefit of the Australian people and the economy. And that's just the start. The government will continue to work closely with industry and states and territories to build a more productive economy through national pro-competitive reform options. Further reform rounds will be informed by community consultation and the Productivity Commission's 5 new inquiries, which include inquiries into creating a more dynamic and resilient economy, a more skilled and adaptable workforce, harnessing data and digital technology, delivering care more efficiently, and investing in cheaper, cleaner energy and the net zero transformation. Significant benefits will flow from a revitalised national competition policy. To help us understand the magnitude of the benefits, the Productivity Commission modelled the impact of 19 potential competition reforms. The Commission has estimated that a revitalised national competition policy could result in an ongoing boost to GDP of $45 billion, as well as lowering prices by an estimated 0.7 to 1.5% over the long run. That's significant. It's an enduring benefit for consumers, businesses, and the economy, on par with the highly successful reform efforts of the 1990s and 2000s. And the benefits of the reform extend beyond their economic effect. For example, reform in the care and support economy would increase the quality of care in areas such as health and disability support. There's tough reform work to be done, but the benefits of delivering meaningful reform speak for themselves. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. When Danish carpenter Ole Kirk Christensen created his iconic company almost a century ago, he named it Lego, after the Danish phrase "leg godt," which means to play well. Christensen understood that openness, rather than monopolistic drive, enabled dynamic, productive and constructive play that benefited everyone involved. So instead of a blood sport where players knocked each other out one by one, participants benefited when they could create, learn, collaborate and share ideas. Today, Lego is the world's most popular toy, with customers buying over 30 billion Lego blocks a year. Raising my 3 sons, my wife and I found that an afternoon playing Lego inspired creativity and laughter. Our evenings spent playing Monopoly often ended in tears. In much the same way, the government's grappling with changes that are shifting the parameters of the playing field. The digital economy and transition to net zero are equivalent to that moment in time that Congressman Auchincloss described as throwing the board. When people get so frustrated that another person, out of frankly pure luck, ends up on Park Place and is able to extract rents every time you cross over or pass go. Through microdata-driven analysis of market concentration, revitalised national competition policy, and the continuation of productive collaboration between the Commonwealth, states and territory governments, competition should foster innovation and opportunity. More Lego, less Monopoly. Thanks, and look forward to your questions.